Welcome, everyone. Good morning to everyone if you're in Europe, and if you're not, then good whatever time of day. Thanks for joining us for this webinar. You can see the title of the webinar. We're going to be talking about our Carbon Market Watch priorities for the upcoming revision. The next slide, please. I'll briefly introduce ourselves, introduce our team. Before we get there, maybe a few housekeeping rules. We've got a chat and a Q&A, and we would really appreciate it if you have questions that you put them in the Q&A. And that you use the chat if you have insights or your own materials on things, but also if you have maybe funny anecdotes, please put those in the chat, but use the Q&A for questions towards us or towards other people. It makes it far easier for us to make sure we answer everything at the end of the webinar. Because we are going to go through our priorities, but we want to have about 15-20 minutes for Q&A at the end to make sure that we can actually answer your concerns and questions. If you can't hear me clearly or something, or one of us, you can't hear us clearly, please put something in the chat and then we can check that. So yeah, about Carbon Market Watch, we're a technical NGO here in Brussels. We try to do science and fact-based advocacy. Not everything we do can be science-based. Science does not have answers on every single design parameter of DTS, but science does give us clear indications of where we need to go, especially when it comes to emission reductions. There's an echo. Is anybody's audio or their mic open here? I don't think so. Check. Does anybody else have an echo, or is it just one person? We only have one mic open on our side, so there should not be any. Anyway, let's continue. So we try to give fact-based answers to every policy question. That's not always possible. But we have a strong focus on carbon pricing. So it's in the name, Carbon Market Watch. We watch carbon markets, and we try to make carbon pricing a fair and effective, or more fair and more effective tool. Effective, of course, refers to the climate impacts. Fair reflects the social dimensions, which we should not forget when talking about carbon pricing. Here's our team. This is the team that works on ETS. We've got Lydia, who will talk later. She focuses on industrial decarbonization. We've got Jenny, who has a focus on aviation and shipping. Emma, who is focused right now more on ETS2, but is getting into ETS1 more and more, let's say. Then we've got Niklas, who is our project coordinator for the Life Effect program project. If you want to know what that is, Google Life Effects. We've got Meli, who is our in-house research and data analyst, and then myself. Next slide, please. So here is our Don't Mess with DTS paper. It has an overview of our 10 priorities, our big 10 priorities for the upcoming revision. And it doesn't just put these priorities in a nice document, but it tries to support those with all the arguments and facts and figures that you can imagine. The goal is here not to just say what we think DTS should look like after this revision, but also to defend that vision. And also to inspire other organizations, civil society, but also business and policymakers, to give them the arguments and the facts and the numbers that will actually determine on where we go. So you'll see when it will go online very soon. You'll see that there's a lot of graphs in there. There's a lot of numbers, and we hope that can really help to inform the debate more. The ETS debate is often a bit more dominated by emotions rather than facts. And we're trying to really inject a lot of those numbers and figures that people should have in their minds when talking about ETS. We're trying to inject those more and more into the discussion. So introduction, the climate crisis, as I hope all of you know, it is getting worse. Also in the EU, we are the continent that's probably going to be the hardest hit, the fastest. And the climate crisis really does not care about politics and economics. It is based on physical facts, the laws of nature. It does not care about the discussions we have in the Brussels bubble on climate change. The ETS itself, the emission trading system, it can play a critical role in terms of addressing the climate crisis. It gives a very long-term, a very predictable signal for the business case for deep industrial transformation. The cap that decreases is a very, very clear signal on where scarcity will go. There's also revenues that can be used, that can be invested where we need them. It makes polluters pay, which is a founding principle of the European Union, actually. And it also sends a signal to our international partners on, and we can see that that signal is actually working, especially the CBAM has made sure that carbon pricing is expanding fast internationally. The EU is not going alone, and the ETS is a very clear signal to our partners that we will not go it alone. please catch up to us, follow us when it comes to carbon pricing. Why is this important? Because, of course, the ETS is right now seen very much from a competitive point of view. We just wanted to bring in the fact that over 80% of the ETS current emissions from stationary installations, so that's all the factories, all the power plants that are covered by it, 82% of all those emissions are still from burning fossil fuels. So the ETS is still very much dominated by fossil fuels, which in a time of Israeli and US war on Iran is, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of fossil fuel savings, of efficiency gains that can still be made in the ETS in terms of our independence from foreign fossil fuels. So back to that competitiveness thing. Obviously, it is currently the dominant political zeitgeist, and we are a bit concerned that the loudest voices are those that are being heard, and not maybe those who are most based on the facts or who bring the clearest picture of what reality actually looks like. And we can see that, for example, high levels of the European Commission, simplification is the language that is being used as an excuse for deregulation. And all of this is to support this competitiveness zeitgeist. We would counter that by saying ETS is not the major competitiveness driver. It is one of many, and there are others that are far more important. Industry was already shifting production to Southeast Asia before the ETS was started. Globalization did not ramp up because the ETS was established. And if you want to fix a problem, if you want to fix a competitiveness issue, then you really need to look at the root causes of it, and that is not the ETS. Here we have one clear figure that shows that actually the industry has not been paying into the ETS at all. It's been a net beneficiary of the ETS. So E3G put out some very useful data on this, that some of the last 3 years, net carbon costs have only been about 3 billion, while financial supports through the innovation fund, member state revenues, that has been at 14 billion. So we're talking about more than a factor 4 of what industry has paid in ETS, they have gotten back. So it's not a competitiveness issue, it's actually a subsidy scheme for industry right now. Our outlook on the revision is that we see a very big risk for backsliding. There's a lot of political push to weaken the ETS. We worry that that will send a very confusing signal to our international partners. It will also upset our climate efforts. Obviously, it is a climate change instrument, first and for all. It will also punish those who have already started decarbonizing, the early movers in the corporate sector. They will be punished by us dismantling or weakening the ETS right now. And then finally, in the era of the Hormuz Strait crisis, it will also prolong our dependence on expensive and very volatile fossil fuels. So while we think that the ETS is far from perfect, we think that there's plenty of room for improvement, it has become stronger every single revision so far, and we would like to continue that winning streak. So our key message is stay the course, don't mess with the ETS. It's doing a lot of things well. Let's not change it too fundamentally and too radically at this crucial point in time. So now we're going to go into our 10 priorities. These are kind of our big ticket items. We didn't on purpose choose 10. It kind of was a coincidence that we ended on 10. But of course, that means that we had to choose a bit. There's many other things that we would like to change in the ETS directive. But we decided to focus in this on the big things. And so you'll see some words that you would expect. We won't be using some of those words that you might expect. And we're also, for that, we are kind of relying on our key partners. So you won't hear us talk a lot about waste incineration. We do think it needs to be expanded there. We know other NGOs such as Zero Waste Europe are really focused on that. Modernization Fund, for example, is also not one of our top 10, even though for other organizations such as Bankwatch it will be. We have tried to look at the top 10 from a very meta perspective. So which things have the biggest impact on the functioning of ETS? We also know that other elements will pop up during the negotiations. So we think that these will be the 10 big topics for the negotiations. But if someone, well, anybody can raise an issue, any policymaker can raise something that can quickly become the #1 issue. We don't have a crystal ball. So we think these are the big things, but we know other things will pop up. I'll quickly go through the 10, and then we will take a bit of turns within the policy team here at Carbon Market Watch, the EU policy team, to go through them in a bit more detail, spending 1-2 minutes on each of them. So the first one is about the cap, that's the cap on the overall amount of emissions, the carbon budget of the ETS. We'd say don't mess with it. Keep it carbon budget neutral, any changes you make to it, because actually the ETS is oversupplied till probably 2035. Second is on free allocation and indirect cost compensation. These have been very negative tools when it comes to incentivizing investment in the industry sectors. So we think we should really get rid of them. And anything that's during that phase out, anything that remains to be given should really be made conditional on climate investments. Number 3 is on the revenues. A big issue in the ETS, of course, is what do you do with the revenues? And we think that a lot of those revenues are not being effectively used right now, and that we really lack a lot of the transparency we would need to ensure that they are used effectively. Fourth is on the MSR. It's the Market Stability Reserve, very important tool, but we can already see the Commission has put a proposal out about a month ago on effectively gutting it. And we think that's a wrong proposal, and that the MSR is actually still fit for its purpose. It still has a lot of work to do ahead of it. Number 5, on international credits, we do not think that there's any space for those in the ETS, and they should definitely be kept out, also indirectly. Number 6 is on permanent removals. Also, we think that those are best kept out of the system. It's a bit of a slippery slope, how you introduce them, and we think that there's better ways to work on removals while also safeguarding the ETS itself. Number 7, on aviation, there's a lot of aviation emissions that are not currently covered by the ETS. So we think that there's a lot to do there in terms of expansion towards covering more of the aviation sectors, more of the aviation sector's impact on climate change. So there's a lot to be done there. Also, there's a lot of biofuel handouts that are not effective climate use of very limited resources for climate change. Number 8, on maritime. There's also a lot of maritime emissions that are not priced. There's a lot that can be done there in terms of expansion. Number 9 is on the zero rating of biomass, whereby currently, if you burn biomass in an ETS installation, you do not have to pay for those emissions. We think that is wrong, and that it actually drives deforestation and the collapse of the LULUCF sink, and therefore also it makes it more challenging for the EU to reach its LULUCF targets. So that's something else that we think should be kicked out. 10, and the last one, is on ETS 2. So we'll be mainly talking about ETS 1 today, but we do have one point on ETS 2, which is leave it alone. There's a lot of policy discussions that have been happening on it the last year or two. It's already been delayed. It's already been weakened. Now we just need to let it start working and functioning and get member states to use the revenues they have to help people in the transition. Okay, that's quite a list of these 10. So let's go on to the first one.
Thanks, Wijnand. We will start, obviously, inevitably, with describing what we see for the future of the, carbon budget of the ETS. And we'll start with its key component, the linear reduction factor that will allow the cap to gradually decrease eventually to 0. And one clear point from our side that there's a lot of the discussions that have happened in the last months implied that we will see a supply crunch pretty soon. And a lot of the proposals that have been made and tabled also imply this. The numbers that we've seen, the number we have crunched or other have crunched for us, tell us that we are not expecting any supply crunch until at least 2035. So that's almost 10 years' time, 9 years' time. We will have one other revisions before that. So we don't see an immediate need to tinker with the cap, with the linear reduction factor, with the market stability reserve. We'll touch upon that later in the short term. If anything, even small changes to the linear reduction factor will have massive impacts on the carbon budget. You can see it on the graph here, representing possible changes that have been tabled by different stakeholders. So just decreasing to 3.4% for the linear reduction factor will release 1 billion metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere and shift the end date of the ETS into the early 2040s, not to talk about change to 2.4%, which will release an additional 3 billion metric tons of CO2 and move us closer to 0 by 2050. Which, of course, does not only mean that more CO2 will be released in the atmosphere, but it will require other sectors to pick up the slack of the ETS. That is, if we still plan to reach zero emissions in Europe by 2050, as we know we need to. That said, we know that there are legitimate concerns about how the cap works and about the emissions under it. We recognize that residual emissions are an issue that needs to be tackled. What do we mean by residual emissions? That needs to be defined, and we think that should be defined in legislation. What we mean by residual emissions is that emissions that are left after all abatement options have been used. Obviously, no residual emissions are produced by fossil fuel combustions, as Maynard mentioned earlier. Still, there's 82% of the stationary emissions that is due to the combustion of fossil fuels. Residual emissions are after the use of CCS and of permanent CCU use. And also, we need to consider that residual emissions are not only a definition that is strictly technological, right? But there are some emissions that are more important societally than others, and that consideration will also have to be made. For this reason, obviously taking into account societal need evolutions and technological evolutions, we propose that a new residual emission cap will be dynamic, not static. Ultimately, then what do we propose? As I said, no need to tinker it in the short term, but definitely closer to like after the mid-2030s towards the end of the 2030s, we will have to make sure that the cap takes into account this predefined residual emissions that will still have to decrease over time. This change and this relaxation of post-2036 of the cap to account for residual emissions will have to be carbon budget neutral. True neutral. We cannot afford even more emissions into the atmosphere. So we propose that in the short term, we have either a slightly stricter LRF or higher MSR intakes so that we maintain the environmental integrity of the all ETS. Again, extending the life of the ETS is not a goal in itself. We can consider that it can be extended after 2039, but again, with considerations for the carbon budget. Next point is on free allocation, and we historically have a very critical view of free allocation, and we know that it has not served decarbonization. They must be phased out because they have been a waste. We have handed out billions in values in free allocation, not only handed out this indirect subsidies. Again, this is a calculation made taking into account the changing values of the allowances over the years. You see this 200 billion from 2008 to 2021. But there are also windfall profits have been made out of them by exchanging the allowances on the market. Certain companies have been receiving way more than they actually emit. There are some, there are some outliers, some clear cases. We know that in 2024, we've seen that a company like ArcelorMittal has received almost double, 185% of their emissions in free allocation. And in general, on average, 90%, around 90% of industrial emissions, heavy industrial emissions, are still covered by free allocation. So they're free, they're not paid for. We have also institutional confirmation that this tool that was meant to protect by an alleged risk of carbon leakage has in fact hampered decarbonization. We know that the emissions that are paid for, that are being priced, especially in the power sector, have been gradually and reduced also thanks to other measures, not only thanks to the ETS. We need to make sure that all emissions are priced eventually, and there is a clear investment signal that CO2 is not a viable investment and we can't afford it anymore. You can see here that is still the case for several sectors, that overallocation is a reality. Of course, we can explain some of it with technicalities such as covering for the use of heat in some industrial production and others. But you can see here for some sectors, the overallocation is stark, and some of these allowances have been banked for the future of the ETS, for seeing a future crunch of supply. So what do we propose? We propose that the CBAM phases in as planned, so that all the CBAM sectors are fully priced by 2034. But additionally, we want non-CBAM sectors that are in the carbon leakage list to be also fully priced by 2034. So we want one phase out timeline for free allocation by 2034, and for these sectors to be covered by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Of course, key sectors are chemicals and refineries. We urgently need to price those emissions. They are still some of the most emitting sectors under the EU ETS. Obviously, we don't want any free allocation for sectors where there is no carbon leakage list. Even with this proposal, even with a full phase out by 2034, we foresee that still 2.3 billion of allowances will be handed out for free from now to 2034. It's hard to give a precise value for this. This will depend on the carbon price, but we can ballpark between 190 and 220 billion of euros in value to be handed out in the next 9 years. So what do we want for these billions of free allocations to be still handed out? We want them to be conditional to decarbonization investment. We want the recipients of free allocation to invest into real, additional, and meaningful decarbonization. We already have tools in legislation that could help us achieving this objective. We have the climate neutrality plans. They are out there. We want to extend their use and make sure that the milestones and the objectives drafted into these plans are made into reality. And we want similar values of investment, like to match the free allocation values that are received, similar to what has been tabled already in a proposed temporary decarbonization fund. This will also show that those who oppose the conditionalities shows real lack of commitment into decarbonization. Connected to this is the use of revenues. We know that more free allocation, the less revenues, and the other way around. We know, and this is really common knowledge at this point, too many of the ETS revenues have been wasted. In phase 3, 2021 to 2030, well, in phase 4, sorry, we are talking about 226 billion in revenues raised. You can see it in the infographics compared to the size of the innovation fund. These were the free allowances. However, those are the lost revenues compared to the free innovation fund. The revenues are around 200 billion between 2026 to 2030. So we have really huge amounts of revenues that can be invested. The list of funding priorities is currently outdated. It needs a fundamental overhaul, and we want to change Article 10.3 to prioritize emission reduction. We want to make sure that we invest in the low-hanging fruits first. And we also need to adopt a people-first approach. And we know that industry needs a lot of funding to reach the climate goal, but we can't only, funnel back these revenues into industry. We also need to honor our international finance commitments through the use of these revenues and obviously also CBAM revenues. For this reason, we can accept that ETS revenues are used to subsidize fossil fuels. This will mean get rid of direct cost compensation in its current form. We can support electrification through the conditionalities mentioned earlier and CapEx investment. Those revenues, we're talking again, billions of ETS revenues that are invested currently in direct cost compensation. They should be funneled into the announced industrial decarbonization bank instead. There are some principles that we can follow on how to guide spending of this revenue. We need to make sure that these investments are additional to what is already spent, and we need to make sure to follow the mainstream, the do no significant harm principle. Finally, from my side, there's much more to come. The market stability reserve. We already have a proposal for its functioning that has been tabled recently, calling for the end of the invalidation of allowances above a threshold of 400 million. But as we mentioned, we don't foresee any supply crunch until at least after the mid-2030s. We propose that we let the MSR do its job. It's a powerful tool, and we know that ETS has been highly oversupplied and still is oversupplied. The cap has been too generous, and even recently, in 2024, we know that 227 million were oversupplied in the cap. We foresee that there will be more chances for oversupply in the market. We know there's going to be coal phase outs. We know we are currently in a fossil fuel supply crisis, which we expect to, well, hopefully lead to a decrease in fossil fuel combustion, which again will mean that we will still have plenty, not too many allowances in the market. The MSR is an essential lever among others. We propose to reject the current proposal because it doesn't take into account other proposals that will be tabled. Mainly, we don't know the proposal that will be tabled for the linear reduction factor, and what at the moment seems to have relatively limited impact, which we still say it doesn't. We expect the MSR allowances to increase substantially without invalidation, but we could get even worse with other carbon budget levers being touched. And we don't want the MSR to become a carbon bomb towards the end of the 2030s. We know you can see in this graph the very important role that MSR has had in releasing us from the burden of billions of allowances, and in fact of tons of CO2 that have not been released into the atmosphere thanks to this instrument. If there are worries about sudden price spikes, we have Article 29A that covers price surgings. We know that ad hoc tweaks that were responding to short-term crisis have eroded confidence and stabilized the ETS, especially also where I'm referring specifically to recent front-loading of auctions. And we can move then to point 5.
Yeah, back to me. So now we'll talk a bit about international credits. I can already see you have one question on that. I'll answer that question while going through this. Our key concern, next slide, is on what this would mean for the functioning of ETS. We already had international credits in ETS at some point in the past, in phase 2 and a part of phase 3. And in Dutch, we say, even a donkey doesn't stumble over the same stone twice. The introduction of international credits and the billions that are allowed into the system really undermined ETS functioning. It brought us to a standstill in terms of price signal, in terms of confidence in the system. We should not go there at all again. It will not help the ETS in any way to bring international credits into it. First of all, there is no supply need over the next 10 years. So why are we talking about something 10 years in the future? I think that the ETS, it's easy to undermine the long-term price signal responding to short-term potential crises. We don't have a crisis in ETS right now, so international credits, we really don't see any role for that. That's not just directly, so companies buying international credits and surrendering them ETS, but also indirectly. There's a non-paper that's circulated where there's a proposal to stock the MSR1 with international credits. That's just another way of bringing them in. And we don't see any need to do that. We don't see any reason to do that. But we see plenty of reasons not to do that. One of the important ones for not to do it is that you will actually, so we had international credits in ETS in the past. There was a lot of controversy after the fact because many of these credits were simply very low quality, did not represent the value, the climate value that they were supposed to. And recent Carbon Market Watch research has shown we don't believe that the PACM or the Article 6.4 credits will deliver substantially better results. We don't see them being necessarily a lot better than what we have right now or what we had in the past. So a repetition of that CDM failure, that's somewhere we don't want to go. Why? Not just in terms of undermining the trust in the system, but it also reduces the revenues, it undercuts the price. And we should really not forget that very recent history. I think lots of the people who are talking about bringing international credits in, they want a price containment mechanism. They want to have a cap on ETS prices. They think it's too high. They don't want to pay for it. And so they're looking for a way out. And international credits is one of those ways out to just put a de facto cap on the price. That's not something we should be considering because we still have so many emissions to reduce on the ETS. On to removals, very similar story there as we see it. The integration of CDR is a very slippery slope. At the moment, price and quality of a removal go hand in hand very much. If you have a high quality removal, it will be pricier. If you have high permanence, it will be more expensive than low permanence. And if you bring very high price units into the ETS, nobody's going to buy them. So there will, if you would do that, there will always be a pressure to release those quality concerns, to make cheaper units available, because otherwise you are actually not doing anything. And the people who want removals in ETS, many of them see them again as a price containment mechanism, just like international credits, or they see them as a way to add liquidity, to add more supply to the market. But then they would have to be purchased, and permanent removal will not do that. We also see a major risk for mitigation deterrence. If you bring removals in, then you're actually telling people, hey, in the long term, we will bring more supply into this market. Don't worry too much about your emissions. That might take the pressure off emission reductions, and that's the last thing we need right now. Removals need, last slide, sorry. One back. Removals need emission reductions. What we mean with that is that removals cannot play the role that they should if you still have significant emissions in the system. So you need to have deep, strong emission reductions before the limited amount of removals will be able to do, before they can actually have a positive impact on the climate. And we need both at the same time. That means you do not offset one with the other. You do not make that choice, that binary choice, that zero-sum game. So as I mentioned, permanent removals is way too expensive, and therefore it won't do anything for the ETS. The European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change expects bio-CCS prices to stay around 150 to 200 euros a ton. The ETS price is around 70 euros a ton right now. Direct air capture, they expect to stay within this 500 to 1,000 euro range for the next few years or decades even. So if you would bring removals into the ETS and they're more expensive than the price, it won't do anything. But it also means that your ETS won't do anything for removals. If you want removals to happen, ETS inclusion is not the way to have sustainable supply, to have sustainable demand for removals, to have a price signal, to have revenues going into that scheme. That's why we would say use revenues, do not integrate CDR. Onto biomass, and you might notice we've done a bit of numerical parcours here. So we've gone from number 6 to 9. That's because 7 and 8 and 10 kind of more belong together. So zero rating of biomass. It's something that sounds very good on paper. Like biomass is sustainable and carbon neutral because it regrows. That sounds good on paper, but in the real world, it drives deforestation. The last year for which we have data, 2024, you actually have 22% of emissions on top of the ETS just from ETS stationary emissions, stationary installations. That means that those that are burning biomass are already a fifth of the cap. That's a very high percentage. And the European Academic Scientific Advisory Council has made a very clear conclusion on this. And JRC has very similar language, so the Joint Research Center has very similar language, that biomass burning is not effective and may increase the risk of dangerous climate change. Why? Because burning biomass in the short term actually emits more than coal. It's more emission intensive than coal, because you have a long carbon debt. It takes many years before biomass regrows, and that's in the case that it does actually regrow. And we see a lot of forestry biomass already being burnt. That would indicate that these forests would be allowed to regrow in a more sustainable fashion, in a resilient fashion, and that's not the case. Often we see very much plantations that are being used for this, and these are not resilient, and there's a lot of other risks to those plantations as well. So we think that this long carbon debt is really something that you need to take into account. The RED framework, the Renewable Energy Directive framework on biomass, is also riddled with loopholes. The NGO Fern has a long list of publications that show all of these loopholes and how this system is actually not functioning from a climate or environmental point of view. And by having the zero rating in ETS, we are compounding those problems, because we are giving a price signal, a price incentive to use biomass, which is problematic from this point of view. LULUCF targets, many member states are really behind on them. The LULUCF sink in Europe is kind of collapsing right now. And one of the main factors, if not the main factor there, is the demand for biomass to burn it for energy purposes. And one of the key reasons why we're burning it for energy purposes is because it's zero rated in the ETS and it's zero rated in the Renewable Energy Directive. So all these things hang together. Getting rid of that zero rating in the Renewable Energy Directive or in the ETS really helps to contain that very unsustainable demand for biomass that's having major implications for our biodiversity and Europe's nature. Here you have an overview of what percentage of DTS we're looking at. This is in terms of stationary installations. Before we were talking about another. So the percentages are different in different slides because we're talking about a different baseline. So you can see here that it's really a significant proportion of ETS is biomass that's being burned. So supposed sustainable biomass, we doubt very much doubt that all that biomass is sustainable. And now over to Jenny.
Thanks, Roland. So next we will look at aviation emissions under ETS. Next slide, please. At the moment, just 15% of aviation's climate footprint is covered by the ETS, as non-CO2 effects and extra EEA flights are not covered. Pricing all departing and arriving flights from EEA airports would raise extra 90 billion euros annually by 2030. The exemption to international flights under ETS was set to give time for the global offsetting scheme called CORSIA time to improve that scheme. However, this has not happened. Therefore, the ETS extension to all departing and arriving flights is fully justified. As highlighted by our previous reports, CORSIA is deeply flawed. Firstly, the quality criteria for offsets are not high enough. Secondly, CORSIA only covers emission growth since 2019, which means that just 20% of emissions from CORSIA covered flights are offsetted by 2030. CORSIA also suffers from patchy or simply non-existent enforcement, as penalties need to be set into national law in each participating country, and they are not harmonized. Finally, CORSIA countries account for only 66% of global aviation emissions, which is below the threshold set in EU law. All of these points further justify ETS extension to all departing and arriving flights from EEA airports. Then on carbon leakage, the risks have been shown to be minimal. At most, 3% of emission savings could be at risk. And these are concentrated on a few long-haul flights, for example, to Southeast Asia via Istanbul. On top of this, a simple solution already exists. So this would be a higher ETS pricing on routes at risk, which would correct any cost advantage of transferring outside the EEA. Next slide, please. So next we will look at the private jet emissions and free allocation of ETS allowances for the uptake of alternative fuels under ETS. So at the moment, 2/3 of carbon emissions from private jets are not covered by the ETS because of high thresholds for aircraft weight, emissions, and flight frequency. Therefore, we recommend covering all private jet flights with a price multiplier of 4, which would reflect their higher emissions per passenger. Pricing all departing and arriving private jets with the multiplier would raise extra 1.2 billion euros annually by 2030. On free allocation for the uptake of alternative fuels, meaning the so-called SAF allowances, these need to be limited to e-fuels, as any support should be limited to the most scalable and sustainable solutions, so not biofuels. A small share of free allowances, which would have otherwise been given to e-fuels, should also be used for contract mitigation. Next slide, please. Next, we will look at shipping under ETS. Next slide. So shipping ETS generated already 2 billion euros in 2024 under the current limited scope. At the moment, smaller vessels and 50% of international voyages are not covered. To support decarbonization, these need to be priced as well. The additional revenues from extra EEA voyages should be used to support the transition in the most vulnerable third countries. The global mechanism under the International Maritime Organization, meaning the net zero framework, will provide an important baseline, but it's not enough on its own to address global shipping emissions. The framework would reduce emissions only by 10% by 2030, while the Paris Agreement would require a 45% reduction. Similarly, as for aviation, the free allocation of ETS allowances for the uptake of alternative fuels or technologies should not be used on biofuels. All support should be limited to sustainable technologies that can be scaled in the long term to support shipping decarbonization effectively. And I would be happy to answer any questions you have in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And now over to our final point, which is on ETS2, to leave it alone in the ETS division. So ETS2 is outside of the scope of the ETS review, and it's important that it's kept off the negotiation table. ETS2 has already its own scheduled revision for 2028, and any changes should wait until then. The ETS2 has already been significantly weakened in the last year, the Commission presented a reform to its market stability reserve in November, which risked adding up to 600 million additional allowances into the system. And in December, a 1-year delay of the system was confirmed in the context of the 2040 climate target agreement. So now it's really high time to leave ETS2 alone. Let's not abuse the ETS review to further weaken ETS2. And member states and policymakers should instead focusing on catching up on the homework of ETS2. Still, only 1/3 of member states have transposed the ETS2 part of the ETS directive, and only 7 member states have submitted their national social climate plans to the Commission, which is the requirement to access the Social Climate Fund, which is there to support vulnerable, especially vulnerable households before the start of the ETS2. So by the delay of these social climate plans, billions of euros of funds are being held back that could be used to support households. Thirdly, member states should also step up their work on complementary climate and social policy. ETS2 is a strong climate policy, but it cannot do it alone. It needs to be part of smart policy mix, where there's also other climate policies supporting the ETS2 and social policy that makes sure that vulnerable households get sufficient support in the transition. And now back over to David.
Yeah, just to end a bit, because now we've been talking really into the depths of the ETS directive and what we see to be changed there. And we thought it might be useful to look a bit, to zoom out a bit and look more at the macro level of why are we asking for this and what is the ETS actually based on. And the EU treaties actually have a few principles that are very, very important for the functioning of ETS and are also, you'll notice in the ETS directive in the recitals, these are, I think, the first 5 recitals are these ones. So it's about the polluter pays principle. It's clearly in the treaty on the functioning of ETS, functioning of the EU. The precautionary principle, another important one, but that is often also linked with the need for preventative action and rectifying environmental damage at source. For climate change, that is very clear. You need to reduce your emissions first. Emission reductions must come first. But another element is not in the treaties that we think should be, and that is the EU's historic responsibility. We are still a large emitting sector, a large emitting continent, but in the past, we have definitely grown our economy and our welfare based on very emission-intensive activities. And we also have the skills, the technology, the capital, the public institutions, the civil society to actually address this issue, address climate change, address our own emissions. And that's why we think that the EU should be going beyond what we demand of others. We should be leading the way, which also, by the way, has economic benefits. Right now, we are running behind on China when it comes to many of the clean tech sectors. Catching up to those is something that the ETS could really help us with. Finally, there's the issue, can we go one slide back, sorry, is on the climate target puzzle. There'll be a lot of demand to weaken the ETS, but the ETS is only one of several instruments, and together those instruments are to lead us to our 2030 and our 2040 targets. If you weaken one of these instruments, that means that another one of these instruments has to pick up a bit of that slack. So LULUCF sector, effort sharing regulation, and ETS together, these 3 need to reach the target. So if you would downgrade ETS, then I think you have to have an honest discussion on which of these other policies picks up the slack. It's not easy anywhere to see that happening, especially agricultural emissions would be very difficult, very politically fraught to address, though they do need to be addressed. So anybody who we think, well, if anybody is calling for the weakening of ETS, we think they should really come with a reply on where does the additional effort happen then. And finally, to go to our conclusions, the ETS, it's a big and a complex instrument, but it's also a very important instrument. It covers a lot of our emissions. It gives a long-term signal. It creates a lot of revenues. There's a lot of elements that make it too big to fail. We see a lot of space for improving it, but that doesn't mean that what is there should be downgraded or should be fundamentally changed. ETS is a climate tool, but it has massive economic co-benefits, especially in the longer term, and we should not lose sight of those when discussing its revision in the shorter term. Finally, it needs to force and support emission reductions. There's a lot of carrots in the system. We'd say that for industry, there's not much stick. You need carrot and stick, and those can go hand in hand, and that should be part of the eventual compromise on ETS, is to kind of balance out that carrot and stick. So our key message to everyone is to stay the course. don't mess with ETS. It's finally working somewhat. Let's not upend it too much. And I'll now also quickly put in the chat. I'll put our report has gone online now, so you can find the link there. Let's stop sharing the slides, and then we can look at our questions. I can have people speak up, by the way, to ask their questions, but I see a lot of them are asked anonymously. We don't bite, so even if you have a critical question, please don't hesitate to put your name behind it. We of course, we need to discuss these things also with people that we don't always agree with. We need to come to a compromise together. So if you don't agree with us, still put your name behind it so that we can have a conversation. On the first one, which is about PACMs, or the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism credits in ETS, I already explained briefly why we think it would not help the ETS, but we also don't think it would have a particularly beneficial impact on the success of Article 6.4 and the PACM itself either. We don't see the ETS as the place to have a sustainable long-term demand for those things, and to have this impulse of finance that some projects, there are good crediting projects in the world. We don't see the ETS as the place to enable demand for that, especially because we do think that if you would have international credits entering the EU's climate system, ETS or elsewhere, you also need to look at overall global mitigation of emissions. You need to look at share of proceeds, etc. And those are discussions that we think are best held outside of the ETS, where we think that there will be a too strong driver towards lower price, lower quality, rather than high price and high quality, which some of the best projects would need anyway. Then we have a question on MSR thresholds. So I'll punt that one to you, Lydia. Do you agree that, don't you agree that the MSR thresholds need to be lowered, because otherwise the MSR allows too much surplus of UAs, TNAC, in relation to the declining CO2 emissions intensity of the system post-2030?
Yes, I'll take that. And if you don't mind, I'll answer also to the question on the linear reduction factor together. I think the two would allow me to explain a bit better our position on that. So thanks for both. So as I mentioned, we don't see an immediate need for any tinkering. We don't see the system we don't see a need for the system to be changed immediately. We don't see a need for the system to be changed to comply with the new 2040 targets. It already complies with them. I think this needs to be very clear. The changes that we will see and that they are being asked for, they do not respond to the need to adapt or to the new climate law, but they respond to the need, well, to sort of market expectations. Let's put it this way. We have seen actually that all of these announcements in the past months have been enough to significantly lower the carbon price, enough for market actors not to freak out too much, let's say. So we can't consider the LRF and the MSR as two separate entities. They work in pairs. So for the short term, again, we are still in the market is still oversupplied. So we don't see the need to relax the LRF in the short term. So as I mentioned, we don't see a need to change it. However, we do recognize a longer term need to account for residual emissions. So if we will account for that, and we were waiting to see a proposal, we're not putting any numbers out there. We don't, hopefully we will release some numbers on what we see as residual emissions in the 2030s and 2040s, but we don't have those numbers yet, so we're not putting a proposal out there. But what we're saying is, if there will be a need of a relaxation in the late 2030s, and this will mean more allowances because the end won't be then in 2039, then let's agree on how we make this a carbon budget neutral proposal. We simply cannot afford even more emissions that have been already planned for. So will we relax towards the end of the 2030s, sorry, into the early 2040s probably? Well, let's take this into account. So either we very slightly increase the LRF, or, and here we get to the MSR, we up the MSR intakes in the short term. This will allow us to have the space in the carbon budget for the residual emissions. We don't see at the moment, we haven't proposed increased MSR intakes, but yet again, if we will allow space for residual emissions, there may be a need to maintain the carbon budget neutrality. We don't want, and we don't, we also highly recommend other stakeholders to not consider these levers as separately. If there's lots of buttons that will influence the carbon budget, and if we press them all together, there's going to be a carbon bomb. Yeah, I hope this answers.
Yeah, I'll add two things on that. One is that Eco Institute is actually working on a bit of that. How should you look at these levers, these buttons together holistically? And their work now really seems to indicate that there will not actually, if you don't touch the system, it will function until 2040. It's in 2041 that we'll get into problems in terms of there not being any supply anymore. So there is really no short-term issue to measure this, and definitely not to start pressing all these buttons. And we see a lot of political demands and pressure to press as many buttons as possible, as fast as possible. Then on second, on those residual emissions, yes, as Lydia mentioned, we will have numbers coming out for this. This is actually also by accident also Eco Institute is working on a bigger study for us on what kind of residual emissions can we expect from the current ETS sectors in 2040 and 2050 to kind of have a bit more of a fact base of that discussion. We know that the Germans and the French have already put out positions on what they think a residual emissions cap would be. There's wide ranges in these because there is a lack of good numbers. And we know that the Commission impact assessment will clearly have numbers on those. And we aim to publish our findings together with the impact assessment to have, hopefully the two sources agree and we have a similar goal and similar vision. But if the Commission impact assessment is maybe not stringent enough on residual emissions, then we'll use our own numbers to feed into the political discussion. There's two questions on removals and then there's one on CBAM. So I'll give you a break before you have to answer on CBAM, and I'll take the two removal questions. They're actually the same. Is on how do we get demand for removals? I used to lead our removals team here at Carbon Market Watch 6 months ago. So I'll take these questions. We do think you need removals. Carbon removals, permanent removals are needed. EU needs to get their act together and start working on those. But we do not think that the ETS is the right instrument to do so. One, it's very unpredictable how much demand there will be. So if you want removals to happen, the last thing that you want is there to be some kind of price trigger that would work in the longer term that may have an impact on demand or not. It will not have any short-term demand simply because of that price differential. The Commission might be looking towards integrating removals with some kind of central bank intermediary institution that would kind of cover that price differential. That means a lot of revenues would go there. So if we're going to be spending a lot of public money on removals, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong, removals are a public good, and so public money should be on the table. We think it's better to do that outside the ETS, to have a separate removals target, to have a separate removals pillar with actual policy that will enable demand for removals, predictable demand that ramps up in the long term. ETS is simply not going to be able to fulfill that role. We've seen that the Commission with their voluntary buyers club, we don't think that that really gives that long-term signal either, or that predictability for demand. And maybe the last thing I'll say about ETS and removals is ETS gives a very blunt signal. If you meet the price, if the prices are equal, then perhaps someone will start buying removals. We're worried that that will be an incentive to keep that price as low as possible by downgrading the quality criteria. So we might now put, I don't know, DAX and bio-CCS, so direct air capture and bioenergy, or biogenic carbon capture and storage. We might bring those two in ETS in this revision, but it's not going to do anything in terms of demand for removal. So next revision, there might be hey, why don't we bring biochar, far less permanent and far less predictable how the permanence will evolves over time, or even forestry or soils. And so that's a slippery slope we prefer not to get stuck on. If you want removals to happen, and we want removals to happen, don't do it through DTS. You need another policy tool that will do that. So I hope I answered those two removal questions. Over to you for CBAM.
Thanks.
From Lisa Oken.
Thanks, Lisa, for the question, which is not an easy one to answer. Actually, I will again take the chance to answer another question also on the CBAM. So the first question asks what What about the chemical industry claiming that these products will not be covered by the CBAM, calling to receive more free allowances? And the second question around the CBAM is about what about the sectors that are currently outside the CBAM, which will remain trade exposed but face declining free allocation towards 2039? I'll answer the second one. We are calling for these sectors to be covered by the CBAM. We do see CBAM as a new carbon leakage tool. We want to replace our current carbon leakage protection, free allocation and indirect cost compensation with CBAM coverage. Again, we want to be very clear that the carbon leakage risk is a risk and hasn't necessarily materialized yet. What about the sectors who claim they can't be covered? Various reasons. Most of the time it is because of complexity. We know that not all products are equal in terms of how much they emit. So what we recommend is start with the low-hanging fruits. We don't have to cover every single chemical subproducts. We need to differentiate by highly emitting products and value chains. We know that there's still really highly emitting products out there that must be covered and won't be as hard as others. We know that the production of primary plastics is highly polluting, and it's not something that we want to incentivize in the years and decades to come. Let's start with that. Let's start with methanol. Let's start with the products that are highly traded and highly emitting, and plan over time for the inclusion of all products. Of course, we do understand that some products are harder to abate and are more complex, and the chemicals value chain is maybe more complex. But again, not all subproducts are created equal. We made it for fertilizers. Surely we can make them for other highly traded and highly emitting products.
Okay, let's do the questions done. I see we have a question on benchmark, but we don't have that much time, and that's a bit beyond the scope of what we want to cover right now.
Yeah, happy to try and tackle that bilaterally.
Lydia will get back to you on that. Then we got a few on RF. We've only got a few minutes, so we have to kind of choose which one do we want to cover. What do you think about the carbon leakage one on, maybe I can take that one because I see you're doing something else.
I can complement.
Yeah, so there's Frank Best who has asked a question about what if these strict priorities, which he generally supports, thanks Frank, lead to serious carbon leakage or deindustrialization and hard to abate industries, and tackling root causes will not work. You see a realistic threat to high emission industry getting crushed between global overcapacities and transformational pressure within the EU. What would we suggest? Well, what we would suggest is that it's not the ETS that's going to cause these problems. The ETS price signal, especially for industry in the next 5 to 10 years, will be limited because of free allocation, indirect cost compensation. There is no real price for many of the industrial emissions that are out there. So if this happens, it's not going to be because of the ETS. But what we do think can solve this is having this strict conditionality on, if you want free allocation, if you want industrial indirect cost compensation, then you have to put your money where your mouth is, and you have to invest in decarbonization. We think that's one way to make sure that industry that was already planning to leave, and a lot of industry is leaving. There is a big industrial concern that we also share on their competitiveness. A lot of those have left because of cheaper labor in China or in Vietnam or other countries in the area. And just dismantling the ETS for them will not help alleviate those concerns. They will still leave if they see a business case for moving. We would rather give them a business case to stay. If you stay, then we will support you in your deep transition over the next 10 years. There will still be plenty of free allocation that's handed out with strict conditionality for deep transformation. That kind of helps them with their ETS exposure. If you reduce emissions, you do not have to pay the ETS price. You're not exposed to the ETS anymore, but you do make it clear that you want to stay in the EU. And I think that is something that we should be supporting. The ETS should be supporting those who want to stay because they want to stay and because they want to tackle their emissions, rather than just a blanket approach where industry gets a get out of jail free card for the ETS cost. Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, very quickly also, because we are starting to run over time. If I can borrow a concept brought forward by our allies and friends at Can Europe, we also need to be concerned about decarbonization leakage. We want to make sure that we favor certain processes that we want to keep in Europe in the decades to come. So we have protected the status quo for decades, and we will keep doing so for still some years, but we need to make sure that the market share for zero emission products becomes larger and larger compared to the market share for highly emitting products. So we need to start putting forward the actors that are able to deliver the decarbonization we need, and gradually become less concerned with protecting the productions that we don't want to maintain.
Thanks. No questions on international transport or on ETS2. That might be good. That means that everybody agrees with our priorities on those things. We are 2-3 minutes over time now. We have you have our contact details. You can find us on the website carbonmarketwatch.org. So please, for those who have questions that we haven't been able to answer, please just send us an email and we'll get back to you on that. I'd like to thank everybody that joined the webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to my team here for presenting and for going into this. The report is online now. Please have a look. It's beautiful. So not just on content, but also on aesthetics. It's a fantastic report. So please have a look at it. And again, if you have any more questions or concerns, don't hesitate to pop us an email. Thank you very much, and wishing all of you a nice afternoon and perhaps also a nice lunch. Ciao.
Thanks, everyone.